Good morning, everyone, and welcome on this lovely summer's day to this 90 minutes of what I hope will be an extremely intellectually stimulating discussion about the future of mobility and the role that expertise and businesses and universities in the Oxford and Cambridge Arc can play in helping to shape the challenges of the future of mobility. My name is Peter Horrocks and I'm chair of the South East Midlands Local Enterprise Partnership. Local enterprise partnerships are an alliance between business, universities and local authorities supported by central government, bringing together those different partners for the benefit of the future of local economies and societies. And the four different parts of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, that's Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, the central area which comprises Milton Keynes, Bedfordshire and Northamptonshire, and our partners to the east in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. The local enterprise partnerships and the business boards for those four areas are closely involved with the ARC Leadership Group. The ARC Leadership Group is the local authorities, the universities and the LEPs who are thinking about the potential and the ambition of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. And this webinar this morning is the latest in a series of events looking at key themes and sectors that we believe are going to be central to the future productivity, prosperity and the well-being of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. They come from the Arc Economic Prospectus, which was published getting on for 2 years ago now, and it identified a number of themes where Arc capability was world-leading and strong within the UK. So life sciences, the future of space, jet zero, low carbon aviation and green energy, and the one that we're talking about today, the future of mobility. And so what we're doing is we're bringing together people with expertise, whether they're from business, whether they're from university, whether they're from public authorities, to discuss these themes, to learn from each other, to put together networks of expertise that are going to help solve the problems of the future and to be able to seize the opportunities of the future. And in that context, we're working within a really high ambition that's been set by the UK government. Back in February, the government published a statement about its ambition for the Arc, and it was striking in two respects. It talked about the Oxford-Cambridge area becoming one of the world's premier growth corridors and a world leader in sustainability. So both in terms of growth and productivity, world leading, but also an exemplar in relation to environmental sustainability, and not seeing those two things in contradiction, but working together in alignment. And of course, the future of mobility is a fantastic example of where we should, with the right ingenuity, be able to progress in both of those ways, having higher than average levels of productivity growth, but ensuring that that's done in a sustainable fashion. And that's what our focus is going to be about today. We're going to approach it very much from a systems point of view. So transport policy is obviously absolutely key, but it's not just about transport policy. It's about all the different capabilities, the industrial capabilities, the research capabilities, both in terms of the policy side of things, but also in terms of research that leads to innovation. And of course, other aspects, the role of planning, the role of skills in terms of being able to extend that capability in the years to come. So don't be surprised if the conversation is quite broad-ranging and brings in a number of different aspects. So our purpose today is to share that expertise, to give all of you as participants through the chat function your opportunity to give your point of view, to make connections with each other. One of the things that we think will probably happen as a result of this inaugural event is to create a Future of Mobility ARC network to enable businesses and innovators across the region to communicate with each other and to share ideas for the future. This is a very opportune moment to be having this conversation. In the next month or so, we expect the government to publish the vision for the ARC spatial framework. For those of you who are not conversant with this kind of planning terminology. That's a really important sort of super planning document that will have significant kind of legal force, although planning decisions will still be with the individual local authorities, but it will be something which all planners will be expected to take into account. And it's a broad blueprint for the ARC. There'll be significant public consultation, and obviously transport and mobility will play a key part in that. And also in the next few months, we expect the government to announce the composition of and the role of the body that will oversee the delivery of the ARC project, the ARC growth body. So as I say, a really good time to be influencing government policy and to be thinking about the mobility aspects of that ARC spatial framework, which will be worked on from about July through to September or October. Now we've got what I hope you'll agree are 4 really good speakers. When we started to research this morning's session, we were inundated with suggestions of businesses, innovation organisations, university experts, who could all have absolutely kind of appeared on this panel. We had to be selective. We wanted to make sure we had the highest possible quality, and I hope you'll agree that the 4 guests who I'm about to introduce are exactly that. So we're going to be joined by Mike Axon from Vectos, Naomi Green from England's Economic Heartland, which is the body of local authorities that is responsible for the transport body, the subnational transport body for the area, Stephen Potter, Professor of Transport Strategy at the Open University, and Mark Westwood from the Connected Places Catapult. I'm going to ask them each to provide 5 minutes or so of introductory thoughts on how they think the future of mobility can best be developed and planned within the Oxford-Cambridge ARC. And then do please start to fire in your comments and questions through the chat, and then the conversation will then develop after their initial presentations. And so if I can turn first to Mike Axon from Vectos to ask him to introduce himself and to run through his initial thoughts. Mike.
My name's Mike Axon. I'm Managing Director of Vectos. We specialise in providing, I'm a transport planner. We provide advice to the private and public sectors on development growth. We also work within the EU on research projects related to the social science and psychology behind mobility. When we talk about mobility, we're really talking about the 3 big issues: climate, health, and the economy. We all want to be healthier and we want to live longer. But actually, having said that, it's not really about mobility, as Naomi pointed out. It's about accessibility by any means to what you want to get. The 3 main areas of accessibility are education, leisure, and then work. And in that, transport per se is now the 3rd question after, can I do it online? Can I do it online and get it delivered? As Naomi was saying, you might coin the phrase digital and physical at the same time. And in the context of climate, of course, as we've heard, surface transport is the biggest emitting sector in the UK. And therefore, that's what we have to hit and target if we're serious about the climate issue. Frankly, we didn't even hit our targets last year in terms of climate, and that's when we weren't travelling for many, many months of the year. So in the OxCam Arc, as with elsewhere, we need big plans, not little plans. The OxCam Arc can help with this, but by being bold and imaginative, not adopting the option of least resistance or doing what we've always done before, because that won't work. So we talk now about something called vision and validate, not predict and provide, where we decide what we want to see and we design positively to achieve that. Now, clearly in the ARC, there's a balance of ways of doing that, but strategic planning of new settlements is, in fact, one and a very important part. And in this battle for climate and health, what we do here is we start with internalisation. It's actually minimising the need to travel. Getting design right in the first instance means that for those trips that frankly don't need to be made long distance, they are contained within the settlement or the community. And that means schools, town centres, hubs, mobility hubs, micro-consolidation centres, third places now that we've been through COVID, places where you can work from home but not at home. And if we do that, for those sorts of trips, we might expect 70 to 80% of containment internalisation, up from, say, 65, 75% for a normal historic town. That leaves us greater opportunity with the infrastructure that we've got for those connections within the Arc and beyond that are most important to our economy, the integration, the interlocking, things that add to the profile of the Arc. And it's there that we start looking at creating those networks of modern, efficient, shared travel systems that the emerging technology enables. And the thing about emerging technology is this. In the fashion industry, catwalk to Primark. You can have something on the catwalk, 3 weeks later, it's in some form or another in the shops. We're not so good at doing that within the transport industry. And one of the things that maybe we need to do better is catwalk to Primark. Lastly, I don't see any room for the approach, what if none of this works, which I do hear quite a lot of. Going back to what we used to do will simply mean we will get what we used to get, and it won't satisfy this trajectory. Thank you. Back to you, Peter.
I think we probably should go to Naomi. Naomi, are you okay to pick up?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. And just as Peter said, I'm Naomi Green. I'm the head of the technical programme at England's Economic Heartland. England's Economic Heartland is the subnational transport body for the region that includes the Oxford to Cambridge Arc. We actually have a slightly larger geography than the Arc itself, incorporating Swindon and Hertfordshire as well. So we stretch across from Swindon to Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire down to Hertfordshire. And that slightly larger geography gives us better access to the corridors that the Arc, that flow in and out of the Arc. And of course, a key part of our role is to provide the strategic voice for the region's connectivity and therefore work beyond just both within the boundaries, but also beyond the boundaries into our neighbouring areas. In February 2021, we published our transport strategy for the region, and this set out the way that the transport system needed to evolve in order to respond to that great challenge that Peter described, to achieve a green economic recovery, to level up parts of our region which do need levelling up, and significantly to achieve net zero carbon emissions from transport no later than 2050, but with an ambition to reach this by 2040. Now, that is a very significant ambition, and it's one that's been set by our local leaders, and we are actively working out how we need to respond to that, working with the Arc Environment Group, who have similar aspirations, and across the wider group. Clearly, the future of mobility plays a huge role in how we plan for that in the future. As an organisation, we're working with local authorities, LEPs, the government and other agencies to ensure that everyone is clear on, within this region, what investment is needed to fund and support delivery, to create the ecosystems in which businesses can thrive and operate, and to get the right goods, services and solutions from the private sector to meet these challenges. But the region is complex in terms of connectivity. Transport emissions in this region account for 47% of our total carbon dioxide emissions. That's compared to 37% nationally, 10% higher. Our carbon emissions are 10% higher than the national average from transport. That is really quite a significant challenge. And alongside that, 64% of residents living in the region normally drive to work. This is compared to a national average of 55%, so again higher by 10%. And we also know that people living in this region are likely to travel further and use their car more often than the national average. It's not a huge surprise given the geography of the region. And in terms of rurality, 34% of residents live in rural or rural hub areas, compared to the 23% across England and Wales. So we have high proportions of people travelling further. We have lots of people living in rural areas or rural hubs, and lots of polycentric movements across the region as people connect with our great economic assets that are across the region from east to west. We don't have a single movement in and out of a city, but lots of areas with significant economic contributions to make. So within that framework, the UK's traditional approach to identifying our true future transport requirements is just no longer fit for purpose. The rise in e-commerce, enabled by investment in digital infrastructure, is changing the way people access services and facilities. Increasingly, the focus is about our ability to connect with the service, be it to better plan a journey through the use of intelligent transport systems, journey planning technologies, or removing the need to travel at all. The future of our transport system is as much about consideration of digital infrastructure as it is a way of connecting with physical infrastructure. And understanding this and ensuring we plan for it now can be challenging. Legacy infrastructure, operators and assets can sometimes be slow to grasp the urgency of the transition that's required. There are a lot of sunk costs in trying to move to these new systems of future mobility, and we do need to recognise that, and we need to work with the government to assist where appropriate with resolving that. And in some cases, there's an argument for a radical rethinking approach. We lack, for example, behind our European counterparts in terms of active travel, infrastructure, e-bikes, and our attitude to walking and cycling is set by the quality of that provision. And without better, safer provision, we will struggle to change that behaviour. And that doesn't just involve kind of mobility that we know now. It's about how future mobility uses the facilities that are in place for micro-mobility solutions. As an organisation, EEH recognises that to support the transition to low carbon, highly efficient transport system for people and for freight, there needs to be an ecosystem that allows our innovators and technology to thrive. So whether that's looking at the design guidance for updating roads and rail, supporting the deployment of dark fibre conduits with the capacity to connect our roadside infrastructure, or working with satellite applications Catapult to better understand what always-on satellite-enabled connectivity will facilitate in terms of future mobility, or simply understanding the impact of home working and super-fast broadband to every home on the roads and on the road network. As an STB, we can remove silos to join policy across modes, and that's a really significant ambition of ours. And without this, we are at risk of repeating the same mistakes that have obstructed us for so long, and worse still, not grasping the opportunity that sits ahead of us. Thank you very much, Peter. I'll hand back over to you.
Some really interesting themes emerging there from Mike. Thank you for that presentation, and Naomi, around the role of planning and preventing travel in the first place. Saying mobility, the question of mobility isn't just about the technology solutions, it's about how you reduce the need for mobility. And we'll be starting our discussion after our presentations on that question of the ARC spatial planning, the ARC spatial framework. So do start to put your comments and questions for our speakers. Our next speaker is Stephen Potter from the Open University. Stephen.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. I must say I've already found those two presentations very stimulating indeed. Thanks very much, Mike and Naomi. Here at the Open University, I and my colleagues have been involved in a number of innovative transport projects that have taken place in Milton Keynes, elsewhere locally within the ARC, and in other places as well. These have all been focused on addressing transport's environmental impacts, and particularly looking at the role of new and innovative transport systems and the role that they can play. I think one key lesson that's emerging, and that's come from our previous talks already, is that simply greening existing transport methods and accepting the way that we use transport at the moment, although it is very useful, will not actually deliver the level of sustainability needed in the long term. And I think that's probably going to bubble up a fair bit at the COP26 in the autumn. My interest long term has therefore been on how a systemic transformation process might be set in motion for transport systems, and what sort of infrastructures and support is needed to do that, be they physical, be they institutional, or whatever. Now, as Mike said, transport is an appallingly difficult sustainability area. whole economic and social systems are built around our existing transport infrastructure and its operations. But transport's climate change emissions and other environmental impacts have dropped much less than that of other sectors. And our government, and let's face it, most other governments in developed countries, are pinning their hopes on what can you call a silver bullet technology fix approach of electrifying transport, electric vehicles, be they battery or hydrogen. The idea seems to be a model that the use of transport won't change much, but instead we're all going to go around in much greener electric cars, buses and trains, and the transport problem will be fixed. There's real dangers in that. And unfortunately, if you look at the economic prospectus for the ARC and also the other concepts that have been around at the moment, there has been a tension between actually looking for something radical in terms of system thinking and the simple silver bullet approach. And I think we need to address that tension that's occurring. We've had the whole thing about whether we will have a big new motorway running along the length of the Arc, and then that has been scrapped. What sort of appropriate infrastructures are appropriate for the future of this innovative, forward-thinking, example-setting development that we're going to be having in the Arc? The approach of keeping transport the same, but with green vehicles, does not deliver transport sustainability and seems very unlikely to deliver transport sustainability. And if that's true, then something more innovative, something more transformative and radical and original is actually going to be needed. So how do we get there? And I think the challenge is how we can build stepping stones from where we are now through to a transformative green transport system. Perhaps that's a wide conceptual thing. So let's look at a particular example. Let's look at local public transport service design. Now, just a few months ago in March, the government issued England's national bus strategy, and that looked about how we might substantially improve bus services. And it's all about better ticketing, integration, information, and, to be honest, other tactical changes. It contains little more than previous strategy documents, and bus services have continued to decline away and become far less relevant to people. I think Naomi mentioned some of the key reasons for that, which is a 21st century pattern of social and economic development doesn't fit the way in which bus services operate. But a lot of public money is being thrown at electric buses. But the key thing is the bus model we have today is not really something that can offer a real alternative to the private car or for most mobility behaviours. The bus is not the right sort of system. The problem won't be addressed by electric buses or even a smart app ticketing mobility as a service interface. That's because an early 20th century service design of big vehicles running on fixed routes to schedule times which you jump in the road and wave at doesn't serve a 21st century pattern of travel demand. And that's a lot of the stuff that actually Naomi was talking about, the nature of settlements and behaviours in the Arc. Now, an example we at the Future Urban Environments Group at the Open University are researching is the new demand responsive service that's been introduced in Milton Keynes only in the last couple of months. And this is a radical approach. It scraps the whole network of poorly used bus routes and replaces them with a minibus service that runs on demand from any bus stop to any other bus stop in the whole of Milton Keynes. It's run by a technology company, VIA, and it utilises a smartphone app. Existing commercial bus routes do continue. These are only the lightly used routes that have been replaced, but it allows the existing commercial bus routes to concentrate on what they do best, which is high volume corridor movements, while the new service, perhaps to paraphrase the Heineken advert, reaches the parts that other buses can't. So my interest is how we can actually get these sort of stepping stone initiatives up and running, which will lead to a much more radical transformative change, and how they can actually provide the basis of knowledge and understanding and build up partnerships between the actors, private sector, public sector, universities and so forth, so we can get the understanding and learning to actually get these things to work properly. We're looking for initiatives that deliver transport solutions now, but set in place a trajectory towards a green transformation. And my vision really is the ARC could be the place where this will happen and be a beacon for the country and internationally. Can the ARC be somewhere where the transforming power of our digital age can be realized? Yes, we do need a really visionary approach. So don't let analog thinking in a digital world stop that from happening. Thank you, Peter, and I hand back to you.
Stephen, that was really intriguing and a great example of that demand responsive transport in Milton Keynes. Just picking up on some of the comments on the chat, Rosie was asking, are we taking questions? Yes, absolutely. This is going to be a dialogue, and some really fascinating and intriguing questions already being raised, both about the role of spatial planning, whether there should be large new settlements, and indeed the rules and the law within which any activity in the ARC takes place. And after our next presentation, I think we'll start with that. We'll start with the overall planning ambition for the ARC and how the vision of sustainable transport can be achieved within that. So do keep those great comments coming, and we'll pick up on them with our panel as soon as we've heard from our last speaker, who's Mark Westwood from the Connected Places Catapult. Mark.
Thank you, Peter. My name, as you said, is Mark Westwood. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Connected Places Catapult, and as a technologist, I'm going to give a sort of a broad view of the technology landscape that's going to impact on mobility, I believe. One of the questions we were asked to consider was, what is mobility's role in designing places? I think it's important to acknowledge that mobility or accessibility, as we've discussed earlier, is a great thing, and it's a privilege we experience in many ways, from a simple walk or a cycle to exploring new landscapes through trains or other forms of transport, through to the lifestyle benefits that we're increasingly becoming used to through things like just-in-time deliveries. But as we know, in excess, some forms of mobility can also be destructive, as seen through the health impacts of poor air quality generated by fossil-fueled exhausts, or the impact of CO2 emissions on climate change. And we also know from experience that mobility can redesign places, and the rise of the private car has given us plenty of examples of how the excesses and unintended consequences of this do not necessarily result in a better future. As to what the future holds, I think in my mind, there's two key drivers for changes in the mobility space from a technology perspective over the next decade or so. The first is advances in energy-related technologies such as electric propulsion and hydrogen, which I believe will open up exciting new possibilities for new modes of transport that didn't previously exist, such as e-scooters, e-bikes, electric cars that are increasingly becoming common on our roads, and some of the more forward-looking technologies such as electrically powered air taxis. This represents, I believe, a fundamental shift in the options available for mobility. Can you imagine taking a zero-emission electric air taxi from one end of the ARC to the other in 35 minutes with great views of the natural landscape as you travel? Well, within a decade, you won't have to imagine it. The technology is already flying today in prototype form, and it will come. This will open up new possibilities and also new impacts or new potential impacts for our environment and design of spaces. from consideration of new flight routes to the urban infrastructure required to support interchange. It's a future waiting to be designed, but it won't wait long. Thinking of potentially a more accessible form of personal transport, consider the opportunities that can be opened up by the e-bike. The gently undulating geography of the Arc is perfectly suited to tempting travellers to saddle up in greater numbers if only we can provide the infrastructure design and the public spaces to support it. This could unlock significant health and wellbeing benefits, acting to prevent rather than repair damage to health. In highlighting these two examples, my key point here is that the next decade or so is going to open up the potential for more fundamental changes in mobility options than perhaps the previous 50. So, exciting times. And these new forms of transport are not just providing us with new options, they're also essential alternatives to today's carbon-intensive fossil-fueled forms of mobility. And the Arc's set to deliver an ambitious goal of net zero carbon by 2040. And a bold vision, investment and deployment of these technologies will be needed and will need to start now to deliver this. A year lost now will be difficult to recover. And to repeat one of the messages that we've heard earlier today and also came from the Arc Energy Revolution webinar earlier this year, there's no silver bullets here. Achieving a future state of zero emissions mobility will require lots of different types of intervention in different places, with a corresponding mix of requirements placed upon the energy system. This truly is a complex system challenge. Unfortunately, the Arc has within it some of the leading research and development institutes and industrial organisations who have both the potential solutions and also the potential to become highly productive members of the Arc and ultimately the global economy. Of course, designing this bold new future will be difficult and will involve some risks. I believe these risks can be better understood, managed and mitigated by embracing the greater use of data and modelling to design this future. Techniques that we've been experimenting with in transport modelling, such as agent-based modelling, coupling that with the data made available today through telecommunications devices, will allow for much better prediction of travel demand, supporting the deployment of more efficient mobility options, management of congestion, and commercial deployment of options, such as the one Stephen was just telling us about, on-demand travel. Perhaps the spatial framework of the Arc will give us the first opportunity to develop and deploy the blueprint for a national digital twin, which would allow these future mobility options to be modelled, to be visualised, and potentially even designed and co-created by the communities which will live within them. This vision delivers on the Arc promise of collaboration, evidence-based and digital-first decision-making. As others have highlighted, behaviour change will also be an important factor in reducing demand and hence emissions. This may involve radical new solutions such as shared vehicle ownership or delivering the vision of a 15-minute city. I think often these ideas can seem like just too much of a change to long-formed habits, but I think it's important to consider the adaptations that have taken place just over the last 15 months and how quickly things like the concept of a 5-day office week seems almost old-fashioned. The examples I've just described make me feel very excited about the opportunities for organisations like the Catapult to play our part in supporting the realisation of these ambitions. And we're already working with organisations across the Arc to stimulate the growth of ecosystems of innovators centred on some of these key mobility technologies. I think the Arc offers us a unique opportunity to lead the development of these ecosystems. And with that, Peter, I will hand back to you.
Mark, thank you. Bracing techno-optimism there from you and maybe from Stephen as well. I said our conversation will be quite wide-ranging, and I can see I've given myself a problem by encouraging that, and we're seeing this already through the comments through the chat. So corralling the conversation in the next hour won't be straightforward, but I thought I'd just set out roughly how I see it. I think we might start with the kind of the big planning side of things, look both at the rural and the urban aspects of that, and in the second part of the hour, move on to kind of innovation, capabilities, business networks, what can we be doing within the ARC to bring people together to be able to find the solutions that the bigger plan will provide the blueprint for? I hope that's okay. So I'm going to start with a couple of the questions that have come in from the chat, and particularly from Rosie, who's really challenging the idea that the planning should be around new settlements, and the answer is to create new sustainable settlements where the need for journeys is just significantly reduced. And I think, Mike, that was something that you really talked about. So I'd like you to address that, and then I'll probably ask Naomi to kind of come in and think about how EEH is thinking about the question of whether it's about new settlements or whether it's about making existing settlements more sustainable. But Mike first.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I take from what you just said, Peter, that Rosie's suggesting that new settlements may not be part of the solution. Sorry, I don't have the question up on my screen.
Yes, sorry, I will tell you what she says. Could we have the source of the survey that showed settlements have 70 to 8% containment? In North Essex, where 3 new towns were proposed, it was clear that new settlements are a diversion tactic from addressing existing problems. I think that's the fundamental thing. You know, how are the jobs going to be close to where the new settlements are? Even if there's containability within the new settlements, aren't they also going to generate lots of external connections as well, and make the problem worse? And Heather made a sort of a related point, which is that Highways England's policy is that it will only allow new settlements if they don't create more problems in terms of car movements. So there's a ratchet effect in relation to just, you know, building more roads if you have new settlements with all these external connections. I hope I've captured what Rosie was arguing there.
No, thank you very much, Peter. I've got that. I'll go through that in turn. So firstly, the evidence that exists is for internalisation within existing settlements, and that's where we actually started from. So if you look at a new settlement, say Evesham, somewhere like that, a small to medium-sized town, you could look to see what people are actually doing using the census data, the ONS data, and the NTS data. And what we find is that settlements like that are already internalising about 65–70% of trips, depending upon the time of day. And that's worked out in this way. It's not all about travel to work. And I just make that point to begin with, because the substantial reasons for actual travel are education and leisure, then followed by travel to work, when you look at movement across the entirety of the day. In the old days, we used to look at commuter peaks, because that was when traffic was busiest, and we felt that we had to build bigger roads to accommodate that demand. As one inspector said, in response to an interpretation of the NPPF, it's not the purpose of planning policy to protect the convenience of the car commuter. So we now build models across a 12-hour period. And when you look at that for existing communities, that's what you see. So what we're talking about is the first port of call, really, in sustainability and climate is local living. Before you worry about how people are actually travelling away, you're talking about local living and internalisation. And you can do very well with that, very well indeed with new settlements, because what you can do with current design under a vision and validate approach is you can design for the elements that contain, you know, going to school, walking your dog, visiting your friends, buying a litre of milk, all of those things that really don't need to be done further away, and which is the premise behind the 15-minute town I think Stephen mentioned earlier, or even the 5-minute, because the way we design these settlements are 15-minute for slightly higher order activities, 5-minute for very local activities, and that's the way these settlements are designed. Which means that you can contain that. In Essex, for instance, Rosie, I noticed you mentioned Essex, you already have some settlements coming forward as part of various local plans, say the Brentwood local plan, where exactly this sort of approach is being adopted and being taken through the local plan. When it comes to jobs, well, firstly, what we find is that, for instance, in Evesham, 40% of those travelling to a place of work are travelling within Evesham. What's that, a 10,000 home settlement? We also found in census data that in 2011, 10% of people were typically working from home. Of course, what we're now talking about is a very flexible working arrangement where we're expecting on any single point in time in a day, 30 to 40% of people in the future to actually be working from home, or a third place. And you'll see the office, the landlords investing in third places. Those are places that you can go to work within your local community without actually having to work from home. So you've got friends and things like that. But a Brewdog do this. That you can work from a Brewdog pub, and at the end of the day you get a free pint of beer, for instance. So that has changed enormously, which means that commuting is not necessarily the panacea for traffic analysis that it used to be. And forgive me, Peter, I'm just going to Heather's point. Highways England policies. My understanding of Highways England, and bear in mind we do quite a lot of work with Highways England, is that they support this approach to life. As far as they're concerned, mitigation for the strategic road network, which granted is looked at in a slightly different way, it's slightly more predict and provide than vision and validate elsewhere, but they actually place weight on the way in which you can actually minimise the demand for trips. And so, you know, where we work with Highways England, they seem to support this type of approach. Peter, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Naomi, can I ask you to address some of these aspects? So there's the kind of the fundamental geography of our area. It seems to me is what your analysis sort of shows, that, you know, we've got a very rural area. So is new settlements the answer, or is it more about improvements within existing settlements? And then the related question of what can we actually do as a region, even as a new large region, because of overall government rules like the Highways England issue that's been referred to? If you can address both those aspects, please.
Thank you very much, Peter. So at risk of not answering the question immediately helpfully, I think it is both in terms of existing communities and new settlements. With the statistics that we have around carbon emissions in the region, like I say, significantly higher than the national average, we have to address what we have already. There are lots of movements, lots of economic productivity already in the region that is causing our emissions, and we need to address them. Absolutely, as you look at new settlements, you have a wonderful opportunity, be that on the extent in an urban extension to an existing settlement or in a new location, to create something special and start from scratch. But to do that, you have to be so early in the planning process that we need to have those conversations now, because it requires the planners to be able to work with developers to get the right infrastructure in place for the right solutions. And so often, through that process, something slips through and the opportunity is lost. So I think in terms of what that means for our region, the way that England's Economic Heartland looks at it, and of course we work very closely with Highways England as well as Network Rail, is that we have a strategic transport network. We have an enormous opportunity coming through the delivery of East-West Rail. But what we need to do is connect places into the strategic transport network. And if that is too difficult, people will drive. If they cannot make those journeys seamlessly, reliably, and know that at the other end, where they arrive at whatever their destination is, they can continue their journey sustainably, they won't make that choice. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is working with East-West Rail to look at how you integrate first last mile solutions into the station provision and the station catchment that East-West Rail is planning for, how you broaden the station catchment because of the first last mile solutions that you put in place. And as an organisation, we've done some fantastic work looking at the personas in the region, the people that are living here, and ensuring that as you design new solutions, new mobility, it's based on the kinds of people and their lifestyle circumstances and how they need. So, for example, many of our new communities have quite a dominant persona for younger families, potentially first time on the housing ladder. They have a high propensity for technology. They like to try new things, but they also probably have young children. Both the adults in the household are working, or all the adults in the household are working. And from that, that means that they have to balance a number of what we call escort trips. They have to drop the children or offer, childcare or school or what have you before they go onto their journey. How do you plan a future mobility solution for that kind of complexity? And that's why we've brought in the persona-based modelling to help our local authorities and transport planners in the private sector as well look at the potential market and how we can get people moving onto sustainable travel. So I think for us, that's the way that we're trying to do it. It's about connecting strategic transport in with first last mile solutions and accepting that people's choices around how they travel are dictated by their lifestyles as much as anything. I think the other thing that is really significant for this region, and it builds on what previous speakers have said, is that behaviour change is an enormous part of this. And what we've seen, we've done some work recently on the potential change in what we call capacity release on the highway network as a result of changed working patterns. And through the work that we've done, we believe that about 10 to 12% of traffic on the highway network has the potential to be removed by changed working patterns. And we've built that on the sectors that are in the ARC, the personas that are in the ARC, and that's the kind of figure that we're looking at. That is really significant in terms of how you plan the transport system for the future. So I think they're all the factors that we're looking at. And I think in terms of working with Highways England, we work with them very closely. I think I agree with Mike that they do need to move more towards a sort of visionary approach to the role of the highway network. And in our region, let's not forget freight, which takes an awful lot of, puts a lot of pressure and creates an awful lot of emissions on the highway network, and really needs to be thought through as we're discussing this, because it's not just about moving people, it's about first last mile freight solutions as well.
Naomi, thank you for that. I want to kind of continue with this theme, I think with Stephen next. I'm going to pick up a comment from Simon Tosland, who says, one of the first points to address is the lack of a formal strategic planning strategy for the ARC. Whilst local authorities continue to allocate land for development without fully investigating the sustainability of those sites, weak or unsustainable allocations will continue to be made. So Stephen, in terms of the ARC spatial framework, you seem to be reasonably positive about what the potential is, but how do we actually ensure that the local authorities are applying these principles? I mean, it's worth, if anyone hasn't seen them, looking at what the ARC Leadership Group has published, supported by all the local authorities in the area, the ARC environmental principles. So they're saying that they want to do these things, but Simon's saying that allocations are not happening, sustainability is not built into policy. What would you like to see the spatial framework doing to ensure that that happens?
You've got a problem here that you've got individual local authorities within the ARC that have a whole load of different perspectives and different understandings. And I think they haven't actually pulled together a particular vision that will actually deliver the sort of sustainability that we're talking about. Now, I think there is a democracy issue here, that should the governance structures for the ARC actually overrule local authorities? Should it actually say they can only deliver things according to certain specifications that are set by an overarching authority? In other words, do you have something like you had in Milton Keynes with the Development Corporation there, and the local authority powers reduced? Or do you alternatively have a process which will have to work very rapidly, where you can actually work out a proper partnership with the local authorities who have very different political views, very different economic views, very different views towards innovation and sustainability and how it may be achieved? So I think this is actually a strategic governance issue. I am rather wary of adopting the old Development Corporation model, where you just sideline the local authority. I'm aware of how that happened in Milton Keynes. I lived through the whole process. I moved here initially in 1974, just when Milton Keynes was being developed. And there was a lot of antagonism between the local authority and the Development Corporation. that resulted. And even when the Development Corporation was dissolved and the powers moved to the local authority, it had an effect which sort of resulted in a rebound effect against what the Development Corporation had done. And it's only in the last few decade or so that we've seen the sort of visionary aspects re-emerge in Milton Keynes. It wasn't actually possible. It actually had some negative systemic events, that very centralist approach. But a partnership approach of actually empowering and not imposing the structure of the ARC upon the local authorities is a much more difficult thing to do. But I think in the long term will be the more positive one. Sorry, that's a rather generalistic term, but I think that's the issue behind it all. That it is strategically about how you work with the various actors and players within the ARC, and whether you do it in a very centralized or a very inclusive form. And there is a decision that needs to be made there.
Stephen, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm not speaking here for the ARC Leadership Group. I'm a member of it, though, so just sort of passing on some information, really. Both, I'll address your general point that you just made, but also pick up a couple of points that have been made in the chat just to answer some individual points. As I understand it, the government's intention with the consultation around the ARC spatial framework is to do something that's more in line with that collaborative approach that you've just enunciated. The ARC environment principles, which I referred to, are aspirational environment principles which have been agreed by the ARC leaders and are now going through approval processes by all the local authorities across the ARC area. I haven't heard of any of them that are not agreeing to it. And then there's going to be the development of an ARC environmental strategy to give shape to those principles. I think the intention of that would be that everyone would agree to these aspirational higher standards, perhaps to try and address the differential that you identified between certain local authorities. That may be slightly de minimis, it may be less ambitious, and some local authorities may therefore go further, but it could at least provide a sort of a set of minimum extra requirements that the ARC is saying that will apply across the entirety of the future planning of developments within the ARC area. And whether that would need central government to give that extra legislative force, or how that would relate to national standards, I think there's, it may be different for different aspects of it. But as I understand it, that is the intention of that process. If that's right, how would you try to ensure that it's as ambitious as possible, without running into the problem that you've identified that different locally democratically elected leaders would see these things slightly differently?
That is you're asking me an extremely difficult question there, Peter. I think it'll largely work its way out in the detail. It's like leaders at G7 or what will be happening at COP26 signing up to principles and targets, and then going home and building a few more coal-fired power stations. Or chopping down half the Amazon, as seems to be happening. I think it is a matter of, it's a hearts and minds thing, which is not just a thing with the leaders and the authorities that are involved, but also the populations, the businesses, the societies, the groups within the local areas, is actually getting them to be really enthused about the potential the ARC can actually deliver. And I think there is, almost going back to the previous point, where we were talking about, got new settlements versus existing areas, rural versus urban. I think slicing down and splitting into different groups like that is not at all beneficial. What we're looking at is something that can actually integrate whatever new developments are necessary. There's a lot of development pressure on the ARC because this is a sort of area which will be expecting to take a large additional population, and that isn't just a planning thing. That is, it's just the economic nature of where the area is located. It's going to lead to economic and housing development anyway, even if you didn't have the ARC. So it is a matter of actually getting everybody on board in terms of that, feeling voices matter, understanding the basis of any concerns, worries, and dissent. You can't have a perfect solution. But let's try and avoid just having formal structures and boxes that you tick for the sake of it, rather than having ambitions and aims which actually excite and motivate everybody within the ARC, not just the high-ups, but everybody.
Stephen, that's absolutely, I think, what can and should happen. I mean, after all, the government has set this ambition for the ARC to be a world leader in sustainability, and our individual local authority leaders going to say, no, we don't want that. So I think if people, like the people involved in the conversation today, are setting those standards, are saying this is the way to be able to give a reality to that ambition, and then exhorting, encouraging all of those individual local authority leaders to meet that standard. I said I'd address a couple of points that have been made in the chat, the specifics in relation to the ARC leadership. One is absolutely in relation to the sort of the degree of sustainability ambition, and John Broad has asked about East-West Rail and the debate about whether it will be electrified early on. What I can report is that the ARC leaders have written collectively with the support of all of local authorities, saying that it's important that the electrification and the sustainability of East-West Rail is considered right from the beginning, rather than as a retrofit. Obviously, in the end, this is a central government decision, but that is a view that's been expressed collectively by all of the local authority leaders across the ARC. And there was an early point about water strategy. We just don't have an expert on water strategy and sewage on this panel, but there are a number of continuing ARC leadership webinars like this, and I'll make sure that that's fed into the team who are working on the broader environmental policy to see if that can be addressed from an ARC point of view. As I indicated, I'm going to try and move us on to a slightly different area of discussion, although I'm sure that the policy issues that have come up in the first hour will continue to resonate strongly in the chat, which is really about the networks of expertise, the relationship between business, universities and innovation, and what more can be done. This is probably on the sort of the second half of the kind of the technical solutions, the sorts of things that Mark spoke about, and a bit of a health check about, you know, how well are we all working together. So clearly this area isn't going to be the place where the manufacturing of the new vehicles, or indeed kind of a battery gigafactory, is likely to be located. But we do have a fantastic heritage of expertise in automotive engineering around Motorsport Valley, the Silverstone Technology Cluster. We've got the Catapult in Milton Keynes, and of course fantastic expertise in Oxford, Cambridge, Cranfield, the Millbrook testing ground, etc. So what more can we do to leverage this existing capability? What will we need to do to develop our skills both at university and in technical education? And of course, it's not only about the ARC. You know, there are national capabilities here as well, and the catapults obviously work across the whole of the UK. But Mark, I wonder if you could give us a sort of sketch from someone who knows and understands the ARC, and what would be your advice about how we can leverage capability more effectively through ARC structures?
Thank you, Peter. Big question. I think just reflecting back on what we've heard from other speakers, and that really there's a theme here about not imposing 20th century transport solutions on a 21st century world. And I'll go back to one of the points that I made in my little introduction piece, which is around the use of data and the use of modelling. And there are organisations across the ARC who have considerable expertise in using these techniques. And we've seen an explosion both in the amount of data that we collect on a day-to-day basis about how people move around the Arc. And we've also seen an explosion in the ability to consume that data and to generate insights from it. And that really was why I touched on the subject of a national digital twin, which is something that's being talked about within the R&D community and within government. And of course, we need somewhere to start. And the Arc strikes me, if we're going to take the vision that's been set, which I think is a brilliant vision of creating a global growth ecosystem or globally relevant growth ecosystem, then surely we have to embrace both the potential of these technologies to help us design this new future. We also have to design, experiment and trial these technologies as well. And as you touched upon, there's some genuinely world-leading test capabilities that are here within the Arc. And I think using those in combination has got to be one of the key attributes that the Arc's got to offer.
And what do you do as a Catapult to ensure that those innovation ecosystems are nurtured, that the relationships between academic researchers and those who are more interested in, the application of innovation, and as I say, what can potential new structures at the Arc level do to facilitate that?
Well, in terms of what we do at the Catapult, I think I would start with visioning and thought leadership. And clearly some of the things that I mentioned in the introduction are, to some people will find those provocative about visions of the future. But I believe you've got to step forward 20, 30 years and think about what the world's going to look like, and consider whether or not it's really plausible that these technologies will not be adopted. So I think part of our role is to stimulate that vision. And the last thing we would want to do is to invest lots of time and effort across the Arc, and for example, pour lots of concrete into physical infrastructure and then discover in 20 years that we've got a whole set of stranded assets. So I think, as I said, part of our role is to stimulate debate about the art of the possible for the future. And then what the other things we do are to try and build communities of interest, and that's extending, defining themes of technology, and trying to extend those communities into the thriving SME environment that we've got here across the Arc, and also with the academic community. And it's one of the nicest things about my role is the amount of time I get to spend engaging with the academic community to try and better facilitate and accelerate the transfer of the R&D capability within our academic institutions, which we know is globally leading, and try and pull that through into the both the SME community and also the some of the larger industrial organisations that are situated here in the Arc, and try and build those physical clusters.
Thank you, Mark. So, Stephen, can I come back to you and just building a little bit more on your description of the Open University's involvement in the demand responsive transport? I suppose it's a proof of concept both in terms of the specific technology, but it also potentially helps us to learn about how the relationship between universities, commercial providers, and indeed local authorities can work together. Could you give us some lessons from that and perhaps try to apply them to the way that innovation networks can be nurtured Arc-wide?
I think the key thing that we've been doing is, although I'm actually based in a science and technology faculty, my background is social sciences. And the key thing that our group has been doing in our work with a variety of innovative projects, both in Milton Keynes and elsewhere, has been to provide a socio-technical understanding and how important that is in terms of getting the key actors and partners involved and actually engaging users with the development of innovative approaches, and not just treat them as consumers to which you sell it at the end of the day. So, for example, in a different project, MK Smart, which we ran at the OU, I think it was the time when you were here as well, Peter, we were actually using ideas such as gamification to engage with users in the design of a information app and get them involved at the early stage of design, not at the end, get to have their input in that. Equally with another project when we were working with Western Power Distribution on smart grid developments. One of the key things there was engaging with large commercial users to see if they could vary their demands at times of peak electricity demand to actually reduce their demand by whatever they could do. Some had additional power generation, some were able to shut down pumps and bits and pieces like that. Demand side, response side of things. These were all very important technical projects, but by adding in the socio-technical dimension, that became extremely important for the success of those projects. You know, for demand responsive transport, the country is littered with failed demand responsive transport attempts, which have managed to run for a few months, a couple of years, proved to be appallingly expensive, poorly used, generating insufficient income to keep them going, and the plug is then pulled on them. It did happen back in Milton Keynes in the mid-1970s as well, happens elsewhere in Europe. Loads of money is thrown at it. I think what you have to have is a very well-designed project which actually gets all the people involved, gets the best from the technology companies, understands the context in which you're applying it, doesn't make a split between urban and rural. The interesting thing is it's a combined urban-rural scheme that's in Milton Keynes, whereas it's a previous demand-responsive transport schemes have been thought as a rural ghetto sort of approach. It's that sort of approach that is very important, of getting the social perspective into a technology project. And if you just run things as a technology project on their own, there is a real danger that they might be a rather interesting answer running around failing to find what problem it is actually needing to address. So I think actually having a socio-technical approach is one of the key things that we've found as being important. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Stephen. Naomi, I'll come to you in a second, but I just want to give everyone who's on the call an opportunity to kind of give us some more sort of systematic input. I'm going to put up a poll, and the simple question is, what topics would you like to talk about in future? So we hope to run more of these Future of Mobility ARC webinar events. And so we've put up a number of topics, proposed topics that we could come back to at a future event. You'll see rural against city needs, logistics, which Naomi mentioned, active travel, various others. There's no limit to the number that you can click on, but it'll give us an indication of what the consensus view is and help to shape our future events like this, and might indeed prompt discussion in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So we'll leave that up for a few minutes and then come back to the results shortly. Naomi, just thinking about the capabilities and the expertise within the ARC, you obviously, as England's economic heartland, interact with a huge range of partners. What do you think can and should be done further to enhance those links and to really build the idea of a kind of network for future mobility?
Thanks, Peter. And I was listening with real interest to those comments from the other speakers. I think what Mark said earlier about the complexity of this world and it being a systems of systems challenge that you have to break down to ensure its success. And I think one of the things that we need to do collectively is actually identify where other parties can help unblock things. So, I mean, I think about the Department for Transport's Future of Urban Mobility consultation, which was looking at regulatory reform. And one of the things that we tried to do through that was capture views from from technology companies and innovators across the region on what we needed to input into that. And I think that conversation needs to continue going forward. We have a direct line into the Department for Transport. We need to hear where there are barriers so that we can help innovators unblock them. That alone won't solve this, and I think data, which we talked about earlier in the session, is really important. So the agent-based modelling that the Catapult have been discussing, England's Economic Heartland has invested in that for the region. We have the agent-based model ready for the region, and actually we've used mobile phone data to validate that. So we have really accurate understanding of movements across the region that we and our partners can use to try and influence and decide how we can plan transport in the future. But on top of that, I also mentioned that we've tried to bring in, or we have brought in, persona data, so Experian persona data that tells us about the types of people that are in the region. And that has a bit more of a market forces type of approach, so that where you might in the private, if you're developing a new product as a company, test the potential market. That's what we've tried to do through our first last mile tool, so that things like demand response to transport, you can look at where there might be demand for it, and then coming back to the agent-based tool that we've developed, you can then look at the potential number of journeys that are already being made on the road between those two places and get a sense of the potential market size of that. The key is then moving from pilot to actually embedding something, and that's where I think there is a duty on local authorities to implement behaviour change so that we get the numbers of people that create a commercially sustainable and viable option for the long run. And there are DRT systems that have been developed in the past that haven't quite solved that. And I think the Milton Keynes solution is a fantastic one, the VIA model that's been developed for Milton Keynes. And I think collectively with Milton Keynes, we really need to push that on people so that people use it, because it's only once you get a mass uptake that you can create something that's sustainable in the long term. And then if I may come all the way back to the planning system and say, one of the things that we've seen and we get feedback from, for example, the bus operators, is that if you get the planning wrong, you then find that the transport system doesn't work. So, for example, if you, as a form of demand management, reduce the number of car parking spaces or garage provision that you have in a new development, all that happens is that people park on the pavement, and then the pavement can't be used for walking and cycling. And if they're kind of half on the pavement, half on the roadside, the road becomes too narrow for a bus to move through, and then suddenly you've got a cycle of a problem that you can't crack because the bus isn't travelling through the development. Then people need cars, and you're in a cycle. So what I'm saying is a very complex system of systems that we need to work together, and I think actively identify where, if there is a barrier, push the person who could open that door and tell them to help you do that. If the innovators need help, come through the LEPs or through us, and we can get into those government departments, and vice versa. We need to talk to the private sector about what we're trying to achieve so that they have a sense of the market that's out there and they can help us find the solutions that we're looking for.
Thank you, Naomi. Mike, could I ask you to address this sort of broad second area, the capability within the ARC, and how would you identify that? How does that compare to other parts of the country, and what can and should be done to enhance it through events like this and through other kinds of activities?
Yes, thank you, Peter. What I'd like to say about that is that in a number of the developments or the growth areas that we're looking at the moment, we want to introduce some of these very, very good ideas. We want to start with classic mobility, 2 feet and 2 wheels, but then going beyond that, we are talking about these sort of modern shared travel systems and networks. We've got some very visionary organisations looking to design that into their schemes. So, for instance, their schemes might be, primary movement networks might be active travel, but then as the next primary movement network, it's shared travel through mobility hubs. What we do, though, find is that we do tend to get sometimes a little bit of resistance right at the nth hour. So when we speak with authorities about this, there's a lot of nodding and saying, yes, it's a wonderful idea, let's do it. when it actually comes to enshrining it within the local plan or within policies, there's a lack of confidence, I find. And that lack of confidence is simply, we've not seen it work before. Therefore, what if it doesn't? Therefore, we perhaps better go back to what we used to do before. And what I think that the ARC organisation can do, yeah, to some extent, some of the authorities haven't been experienced across the UK at implementing these. What the ARC can do is it can bring this together under, if you like, one body and say, look, let's have the confidence to actually design and to go forward in this way. And the consequence of doing that is that perhaps we don't go back to doing what we did before just in case it doesn't work. That, I think, is the biggest area of sort of resistance that I find, the lack of confidence. We are looking at, in some of these, I mean, there's some very visionary people out there, Harrington, for instance, in Oxfordshire, looking at actually implementing semi-demand responsive services, you know, a halfway house to begin with, moving forward to demand responsive services in the future. And of course, we know that demand response is being trialled down the road at Milton Park. And they would like to invest in that, and they would prefer to invest in that than, to be perfectly honest, invest in big highway infrastructure schemes if all the purpose of those schemes to do is to make life a little bit more convenient at 8:30 in the morning. It's one of 50 things that we want to do, but that's the position we're in. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mike. Can we bring up the results of the poll just to get a sense of which are the topics that participants are most interested in for the future? So decarbonisation clearly strongest. Oh, behaviour strong. Setting targets for the ARC. So no, quite a wide range, but the core issue of net zero and decarbonisation is clearly the strongest one there. So we'll use that in considering how we shape any future events. As one of the participants in the chat has acknowledged, not possible, unfortunately, for all of the really shrewd comments that are being made there to be reflected in the conversation. You know, classic synchronous, asynchronous discussions. But I'm trying to draw the threads from some of that, and I think that the process around the ARC spatial framework is likely to be at least the first place where this all comes together. Clearly, a number of you are challenging some of the overall assumptions about the level of growth that there might be in the ARC, and that's absolutely something which needs to be fed into that spatial framework process. Just to pick up on something which Stephen Potter said about the importance of digital, I know from having heard presentations from the government team that are putting together the consultation. It is a central government consultation primarily from the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, but that will be done very consciously as a digital process to encourage as wide a range of people, and not the people who might normally go along to a planning meeting in a local parish hall, but to try and make that as widespread as possible. So I suppose my question for the last few minutes is, how can you potentially distill some of the consensus and some of the questions that have developed in the course of this morning as an input into that ARC spatial framework process? It's obviously bigger than transport and mobility, but mobility is an absolutely integral part of it. England's economic heartland already has a transport strategy which Naomi has referred to, which is consulted on widely. But now there's an opportunity for that approach and the wider ARC planning to come together. For the environment as a whole, there's been an environmental working group which has helped to create the ARC environmental principles. And so, to respond to a particular comment from John Broad in relation to the flora and fauna of the area, those ARC environmental principles talk in straightforward terms about doubling nature. Questions about exactly how you define that, but at least it's a clear ambition that the development of the ARC should also go along with it, have alongside it a doubling of nature. So the environmental organisations have worked closely together with the ARC leadership to produce these ARC environmental principles, and as I explained earlier, now to develop an ARC environment strategy. Is there an equivalent for mobility and transport? How would all of the participants on this event this morning like to see that being distilled and fed into the spatial framework? Naomi, can I ask you to sort of talk a little bit about process, how what you've already done as England's economic heartland, how might that relate to the spatial framework, and what would you encourage participants on the call this morning to do with this opportunity for consultation that's coming up?
Thanks, Peter. So the England's Economic Heartland Transport Strategy, the Regional Transport Strategy, which we published in February, sets the framework for connectivity in the region, and the way that we've described it, as I talked about earlier, is that we have brought in quite a lot of focus on connectivity through to the first last mile, which is quite, while we're strategic in nature, is so important in this region. So I think in the spatial framework, we will be looking for how we can reinforce those messages to create connectivity in local communities to strategic transport, so that you get a single network. For colleagues on the call and speakers, I think what's really important for us is to reinforce the fact that the time is now, and actually we need to look at solutions now. So while the spatial framework may take 2 years to produce, as I think Mark said earlier, solutions are ready, and we need to act on them, and we need to create the conditions to do that. So I think there's some feedback there about pace of implementing change. The other thing I think that is really important that we talk about is actually funding, and the point I think that was raised earlier by Mike around the challenge for local authorities in having the confidence to take bold decisions on future mobility solutions, where perhaps they feel like the safer option is to go for what they know. Because funding is tight, often it's in competition, so they go for where they think they can secure the most funding for their communities. There is a real role for the spatial framework to promote innovation, encourage creative solutions, and ensure that behind the scenes the public sector is providing the data to support that, which is one of the things that we've tried really hard to do in EEH. We need to make sure that we can give the evidence to and encourage people to make bold decisions, and that's where the private sector can really come in. I think funding is a really important one at the moment. Funding for transport is modally focused, so we have long-term funding for road, long-term funding for rail, and competitive funding for smaller solutions, and they're annualised anyway. So it's very hard for innovators or local authorities to plan really big sustainable transport solutions, because the way the funding isn't quite so clear out into the future. One thing I will say, and then I will stop, Peter, and give my colleagues time to speak, is I do know that there is a huge appetite within government for walking and cycling in this region, and micro-mobility, sustainable, healthy micro-mobility. I think the government is looking for ways to deliver that. So there is appetite, their ears are open, and we want to work with the region and with the sector to help unlock those doors and create really a healthy, sustainable transport network across the region.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you.
Based on the conversation I had a few minutes ago with Mike, who I know is a huge cycling enthusiast and indeed is a peloton captain, I'll go to Mike next, and your advice about how what we've been discussing this morning should feed into the spatial framework, and then I'll come to the other two speakers.
Thank you, Peter. I might say the same about you, actually, in terms of cycling. Thank you very much. I'm going to steal something from Naomi, actually, because I think what the spatial strategy needs to invest in, as much as anything else, is winning over hearts and minds within the ARC environment. Because the transport strategy message is, of course, good. People can sign up to that. But there are consequences. And to some extent, the strategy needs to be honest about those consequences and clear and decisive about the fact that there will be benefits, but also some disbenefits to some people. And therefore, when we're talking about innovators, you can innovate in a big way, which is what the strategy talks about. You can also innovate in a myriad, 100, 200 small ways. And I think the strategy should acknowledge that you can do that, those small improvements within the framework of the large improvements. So my big point is invest in winning over the hearts and minds, because that's the way we will actually end up implementing this sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, your concluding thoughts. How should the thoughts from this morning be fed into the spatial framework and the consultation process?
I think Mike's point about confidence building and confidence among everybody is actually extremely important. The other thing is, I think adaptability should be quite a watchword for this. We've already looked at this morning. There's a lot of options opening in terms of transport, in terms of sustainability approaches and so forth. There is a bit of a danger that we mustn't actually set in concrete, so as to speak, the infrastructure and the spatial framework approach. We should have a spatial framework which can adapt to new trends, new opportunities emerging, because we don't know how these things are going to be working out. Naomi's point about funding is important. I'd also like to add in regulatory issues here, and I think that actually relates to it as well. It's the way, Naomi mentioning the compartmentalization of funding, but the compartmentalization of regulation is true as well. The demand responsive transport has hit a problem with that in Milton Keynes, because in actual fact they're using small vehicles under taxi regulations, not under public service vehicle bus operations, and hence that closes off a lot of funding to the scheme. It's self-financing without that, but boy, do the regulations make things rather difficult. We're not in such a clear-cut world as those regulations envisage. We need something far more flexible and adaptable, and that really comes to it. Just coming to the cycling point at the very end, I think it's interesting. Milton Keynes is often viewed as having a brilliant cycling network. In actual fact, it's rubbish for cycling. It actually has a lower proportion of cycling than any comparable city around the countryside. And that's because cycling facilities were implemented within a car-oriented structure, a car-oriented spatial framework, which we're still trying to work out with the legacy of it today. So be important that the framework has actually got to have the sustainable behaviors and modes at its heart, not just tacking them on to the traditional one. And that is a danger. And that's what I mean about let's not have analog thinking restricting digital and sustainability potential. Let's actually have that potential built in at the heart and forming the spatial framework rather than constraining the possibility for sustainability. Thank you,
Stephen. Thank you. I think that's a very fair summary of our discussion this morning. Mark, quick last thought from you, and then we'll close.
I think lots to be excited about, actually, and reflecting on Naomi's comments about how EEH are building their understanding of data and the strategies. I think that strikes me as a world-class approach. So lots to be excited about there, and particularly the focus on first and last mile solutions, which is just fundamental to giving people viable options to a car. And a lot of this boils down to change is going to be driven by providing better options, not different or slightly more awkward options. And first and last mile, I think, is key. Really interested in Mike's comments around risk and decision making. And I think the success of the ARC is going to be achieved not just through a small number of big decisions, but thousands of small decisions. And how do we help people that are making those small decisions make the right ones? And I think we haven't talked much today about skills and knowledge transfer and helping all of those decision makers understand the full landscape that they're making decisions within. I think that's something that would help, and would also help make best use of the funding that is available as well, and help people understand what to do with that when it's available. So I'll close with that.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists for their exceptional expertise. And thank you particularly to all of you participating. I haven't seen a chat in one of these events that's been quite as vigorous. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the points. We'll try and make sure that where specific questions were asked, that they are picked up offline. Time to close now, to go out and enjoy the fantastic countryside, not yet from the electric air taxi that was promised, but not far away apparently. Thank you very much for all of your contributions this morning. Thank you to Cranfield University and the technical team here for hosting the event, to Karen Clark from the ARC Leadership Communications team. Thank you all for taking part. Bye-bye.